The morning sun cast long shadows across the volcanic landscape of Pyros 7 as students gathered at the observation deck of the Galactic Engineering Academy. The air shimmered with heat even at this early hour, and the ground beneath their feet vibrated with the constant rumble of the planet's active core. Professor Veltar stood at the edge of the platform, his crystalline body catching the sunlight and throwing rainbow patterns across the metal floor. He was tall, even by alien standards, with sharp geometric features that seemed carved from living diamond. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who had taught the galaxy's brightest minds for over 3 centuries. "Look, beyond this platform," Veltar said, his words translated instantly through the universal devices each student wore. "What you see before you has defeated the greatest engineering minds in known space for over 500 years. The students pressed forward to get a better view. Spread out before them was the great lava field of Pyros 7. A massive expanse of molten rock that stretched to the horizon. The surface bubbled and shifted constantly, sending waves of superheated air upward that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. Streams of liquid fire cut across the field in ever-changing patterns, and occasionally great fountains of lava would erupt skyward before falling back to the burning surface. The field is 50 kilometers across at its narrowest point," Veltar continued. "The surface temperature reaches 1200 degrees Celsius. The rock beneath is in constant motion, making any permanent structure impossible. And yet, crossing this field would open up the entire southern continent for colonization and resource extraction." Jiho Kim stood near the back of the group, sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the climate controls built into his academy uniform. He was one of only 5 humans at the prestigious academy, part of an exchange program that had taken years of diplomatic negotiation to establish. At 22, he was older than most of his classmates, having spent several years working in Earth's geological survey before qualifying for the program. Around him, the other students whispered excitedly in dozens of languages. The Repthari, students with their scaled skin and multiple arms, were already pulling out advanced scanning equipment. The Nethans, beings of living gas contained in environmental suits, began calculations that appeared as floating numbers in the air around them. The Luxoids, creatures of pure energy taking humanoid form, started generating complex holographic models. "Your final project," Professor Veltar announced, causing the chatter to die instantly, "will be to design a method for crossing this lava field. You have 1 month to prepare, 1 day to demonstrate, and unlimited access to the Academy's resources." A Repthari student named Sektal raised one of his 4 arms. "Professor, what parameters must our solution meet?" "Excellent question," Veltar replied. "Your crossing method must be able to transport at least 100 beings safely across. The field, it must be cost-effective enough for commercial use, and it must be reliable enough to guarantee the safety of those who use it." Sektal nodded, his vertical pupils already dilating as he began mental calculations. "And the budget for materials and energy?" "Unlimited," Veltar said. "The Galactic Engineering Council has authorized full funding for any promising solution." The students erupted in excited conversation again. Jiho heard them discussing force fields that could deflect the heat, anti-gravity platforms that could float above the danger, and teleportation systems that could bypass the field entirely. Each idea seemed more complex and expensive than the last. While his classmates talked about technologies that sounded like magic to human ears, Jiho pulled out a simple paper notebook and began sketching the landscape. He drew the lava field, but also the surrounding terrain that everyone else seemed to be ignoring. To the east, he could see what looked like dried mud flats. To the west, rocky outcroppings showed clear signs of volcanic ash deposits. "Human," a voice said behind him. Jiho turned to see Veltar approaching, his crystalline features reflecting Jiho's own face back at him in fractured images. "I see. You are taking notes. Do you have questions about the assignment?" "No, sir," Jiho replied. "I'm just trying to understand the whole picture." Veltar's head tilted in a way that reminded Jiho of a curious bird. "The whole picture?" "The lava field, yes, but also everything around it. The geology, the climate patterns, the natural processes that created this environment." Jiho gestured toward his rough sketches. "On Earth, we have active volcanic regions, too. Understanding how they work naturally can sometimes suggest solutions that work with the environment instead of against it." For a moment, Veltar was silent. When he spoke again, his tone carried what might have been amusement. "Young human, your species is new to galactic engineering. Perhaps you should consider partnering with one of the more experienced students. This challenge requires sophisticated technology and advanced understanding of physics." Before Jiho could respond, Sektal approached them. The Repthari's scaled face showed the confident expression of someone accustomed to academic success. "Professor Veltar, I would be willing to include the human in my project team. His species could benefit from observing proper engineering methodology." "That's very generous of you, Sektal," Veltar replied. "Jiho, would you like to join his team?" Jiho looked at Sektal, then back at the lava field. Something about the way the heat shimmer rose from the surface reminded him of sights he had seen on Earth, places where his sister Mina had explained how rapid cooling could create stable surfaces from molten rock. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'd like to work on my own approach first. If it doesn't work out, maybe I can join a team later." Sektal's face showed what Jiho was learning to recognize as the Repthari equivalent of a shrug. "As you wish. But do not expect miracles from primitive human technology." As the class began to disperse, Professor Veltar remained at Jiho's side. "You understand, human, that this challenge has defeated teams of the galaxy's most brilliant minds? Engineers with access to technologies your species cannot even comprehend have tried and failed to cross this field." "I understand, sir," Jiho said, still sketching in his notebook. "But sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced ones miss." Veltar made a sound that the translator couldn't interpret. "Fresh eyes, yes, but this requires more than new perspectives. It requires mastery of advanced sciences that take centuries to develop." Jiho looked up from his notebook, meeting the professor's multifaceted gaze. "With respect, sir, My species has been dealing with volcanic activity for thousands of years. We might not have the most advanced technology, but we've learned to work with natural forces instead of always trying to overwhelm them. Natural forces, Veltar repeated slowly. How quaint. Very well, human. You have 1 month to prove that. Primitive methods can succeed where advanced civilization has failed. As the professor walked away, Jiho turned back to the lava field. The sun was climbing higher now, and the heat was becoming almost unbearable even through the observation deck's shielding. But he continued sketching, noting wind patterns, the way the lava moved, and especially the deposits of cooled material around the field's edges. In the distance, he could see his classmates already heading back to the Academy's laboratories, eager to begin work on their complex technological solutions. But Jiho remained on the deck, watching and learning from the volcano itself. He had a month to prove that sometimes the best solutions were also the simplest ones. 3 days had passed since Professor Veltar announced the assignment, and the Galactic Engineering Academy buzzed with activity. In the advanced laboratories, teams of alien students worked with technologies that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Holographic displays showed complex molecular structures, energy field calculations, and theoretical frameworks that would have made Earth's greatest scientists weep with envy. Jiho spent those 3 days differently. While his classmates remained in their climate-controlled labs, he ventured out into the harsh landscape surrounding the Academy. The Academy's safety protocols required him to wear an environmental suit during these expeditions, but he had quickly learned to work within its limitations. On the morning of the 4th day, he found himself at the eastern edge of the lava field, where the molten rock met a series of dried mud flats. The area was clearly off-limits to most students, marked by warning signs in 17 different languages. But Jiho had obtained special permission from the Academy's geological department, claiming he needed samples for comparative planetary analysis. The mudflats stretched for several kilometers, their cracked surface telling the story of ancient, volcanic activity. Jiho knelt beside one of the deeper cracks and carefully collected samples in specially sealed containers. The mud was rich with minerals leached from volcanic ash over countless years. More importantly, it contained exactly the type of clay particles he remembered from his sister's research on Earth. "What are you doing out here, human?" Jiho looked up to see Sektal approaching, accompanied by 2 other Repthari students. The alien's environmental suits were far more advanced than his own, featuring built-in analysis equipment and personal force fields that shimmered around their bodies. "Collecting samples," Jiho replied, sealing another container. "I want to understand the local geology before I design my solution." Sektal's translation device carried a tone of obvious amusement. "You still intend to proceed with your primitive approach? My team has already identified 3 promising technological solutions. We are currently deciding between quantum phase manipulation and localized gravity negation." "Those sound impressive," Jiho said honestly. "How much will they cost?" "To implement? Cost." One of Sektal's companions, introduced as Kethnil, seemed puzzled by the question. "We have unlimited funding authorization. Cost is irrelevant when dealing with advanced engineering solutions. Jiho stood, his collection bag now heavy with mud and clay samples. Professor Veltar said our solution needs to be cost-effective for commercial use. Doesn't that make cost relevant? The three Repthari exchanged glances that Jiho was learning to interpret as confusion mixed with condescension. Human, Sektal said carefully. When the professor mentioned cost-effectiveness, he was obviously referring to the efficiency of advanced technologies. No one expects primitive methods to actually succeed. Then why give the assignment at all? Jiho asked. Educational value, Kethnil replied. Students learn as much from failure as from success. Your attempt will demonstrate why sophisticated engineering solutions are necessary for sophisticated problems. As the Repthari continued toward the academy, Jiho heard them discussing his quaint approach in their native language. His translator couldn't handle their rapid conversation, but their tone made their opinion clear enough. Back in his dormitory room that evening, Jiho spread his samples across his desk and began basic analysis using the Academy's standard equipment. The results confirmed his hopes. The local clay had exactly the right mineral composition for rapid heat absorption. More importantly, when mixed with certain volcanic ash compounds, it showed promising thermal shock resistance. He opened a communication channel to Earth, waiting through the inevitable delay as his signal crossed the vast distance to his home planet. When his sister Mina's face finally appeared on the screen, her excitement was immediately obvious. Jiho, how are things at the fancy alien academy? Mina grinned from her laboratory on Earth, surrounded by rock samples and geological charts. Are you learning to build spaceships out of pure thought yet? Not exactly, Jiho laughed. Actually, I could use your expertise on something. I'm working on a project that involves rapid cooling of lava flows. Mina's expression grew more serious and interested. Lava cooling? That's right in my wheelhouse. What's the situation? Jiho explained the assignment, the lava field, and his preliminary analysis of the local materials. As he talked, Mina began pulling up files on her computer, cross-referencing his descriptions with her own research data. This is fascinating, Mina said when he finished. The mineral composition you're describing is similar to what we find near Mount Vesuvius. We've used controlled cooling techniques there for construction projects. The key is getting the right mixture ratio and application method. My classmates think I'm crazy for trying this, Jiho admitted. They're building force fields and anti-gravity platforms. Of course they are, Mina laughed. They're thinking like engineers trying to overpower nature. You're thinking like a geologist trying to work with it. There's a big difference. Over the next hour, Mina walked Jiho through the theoretical framework for rapid lava cooling. The process wasn't magic, she explained, but it required precise understanding of heat transfer, thermal shock principles, and material science. When done correctly, the cooling process could actually strengthen the resulting surface, creating volcanic glass stronger than steel. The beautiful thing about this approach, Mina concluded, is that it's self-reinforcing. Each section you cool makes the next section easier to cool. You're not fighting the volcano, you're convincing it to work with you. After ending the call, Jiho spent several more hours calculating mixture ratios and cooling rates. The mathematics were complex, but not beyond his understanding. More importantly, they suggested that his approach might actually work. The next morning brought the first project review session. Professor Veltar had arranged for students to present their preliminary designs to a panel of academy instructors. The advanced laboratory was packed with elaborate holographic displays showing impossible technologies. The Luxoid team presented first, their energy-based forms crackling with excitement as they demonstrated a light bridge concept. The bridge would use concentrated photon streams to create a solid pathway across the lava field. The presentation was dazzling, literally, with displays of rainbow-colored light that showed how the bridge would adapt to changing conditions. Impressive, Professor Veltar commented. What are your power requirements? 3 fusion reactors, operating at maximum output, the Luxoid team leader replied, plus backup power systems and redundant safety protocols. And construction time? Approximately 6 months for the primary installation, assuming no complications. Next came the Nethan team, whose gaseous forms moved gracefully around their presentation area. They had designed an atmospheric manipulation system that would create a localized environment above the lava field, allowing conventional transportation to operate safely. The system requires precise control of atmospheric density, temperature, and composition across a 50-kilometer area, their spokesperson explained. Our calculations show 97% reliability under optimal conditions. And under non-optimal conditions? Asked Dr. Kethvar, the Academy's senior engineering professor. Reliability drops to approximately 73%. However, we believe these parameters are acceptable for commercial operation. When Sektal's team presented their gravity negation platform, the display showed sleek vehicles floating effortlessly above the lava field. The technology was elegant and sophisticated, requiring only minimal power once the initial field generators were constructed. Our approach eliminates contact with the hostile environment entirely, Sektal explained proudly. Passengers would experience no heat, no toxic gases, and no risk from surface instability. Excellent work, Professor Veltar said. All of these proposals demonstrate sophisticated understanding of advanced engineering principles. Finally, it was Jiho's turn. He walked to the front of the room carrying only his notebook and a small case of samples. The contrast with the elaborate holographic displays was immediately obvious. My approach is different, Jiho began simply. Instead of building technology to fight the lava field, I want to use natural processes to work with it. He opened his sample case and showed the assembled professors his clay and ash mixtures. These materials can rapidly cool molten rock through controlled heat absorption. The process creates a stable, permanent pathway that actually gets stronger over time. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Dr. Kethvar leaned forward in his chair. Human, are you proposing to defeat 1200-degree lava with mud? Specially formulated mud, Jiho corrected. Mixed with volcanic ash in precise ratios to optimize thermal transfer and shock resistance. Professor Veltar's crystalline features seemed to shimmer with what might have been suppressed laughter. And how long would this Mud pathway take to construct? Based on my calculations, approximately 12 hours for a complete crossing, using materials that cost less than 100 credits. The silence that followed was broken by barely suppressed chuckling from the student gallery. Even some of the professors seemed to be. Word spread quickly through the Galactic Engineering Academy about the humans' unusual approach to the lava field challenge. By the end of the week, Jiho found himself the subject of curious stares and barely concealed amusement wherever he went. Students would point him out to their friends, whispering about the primitive human who thinks he can cool lava with mud. The Academy's vast library became Jiho's second home as he researched everything he could find about volcanic activity across different worlds. The Galactic Archives contained geological data from thousands of planets, and Jiho was surprised to discover that rapid cooling techniques had been used successfully on several worlds throughout history. The knowledge seemed to have been forgotten as civilizations became more technologically advanced. Interesting reading material, a voice said behind him. Jiho looked up from his research terminal to see Yuna Park, one of the few other humans at the Academy. She worked in the facility maintenance department, keeping the complex environmental systems running that allowed beings from dozens of different worlds to coexist in one location. Her job wasn't glamorous, but Jiho had learned that she knew the Academy better than anyone, just trying to understand how other civilizations have dealt with similar challenges. Jiho replied, gesturing at the screen full of geological data. Yuna sat down in the chair next to him, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. I've been hearing talk about your project. Some of the maintenance staff think you're crazy, but others are curious. We deal with heat management problems all the time here, just on a smaller scale. Really? What kind of problems? The Luxoid dormitories generate enormous amounts of thermal energy. We have to use specialized cooling systems to keep them from overheating the rest of the building. And the Repthari prefer temperatures that would cook most other species, so we need rapid temperature transitions between different areas. Jiho's eyes lit up. How do you handle rapid temperature changes without damaging the systems? Thermal buffers, Yuna explained. We use materials that can absorb heat quickly and then release it slowly. Nothing fancy, just good engineering principles applied carefully. She pulled up some maintenance schematics on the terminal, showing Jiho the cooling systems that kept the Academy running. The technology was sophisticated, but the underlying principles were surprisingly similar to what he was proposing for the lava field. The thing is, Yuna continued, some of the older maintenance workers remember stories from their home worlds. Before they had advanced technology, their ancestors dealt with volcanic activity using natural methods. They talk about it like ancient history, but some of the techniques sound similar to what you're describing. That evening, Jiho called his sister again. Mina appeared on the screen surrounded by even more geological samples than before, her excitement evident as she held up charts and diagrams. I've been researching your project non-stop since we last talked, she said without preamble. Jiho, this could be revolutionary. I found historical examples of rapid cooling techniques from at least a dozen different cultures on Earth. The Romans used controlled water application to cool volcanic glass for construction. Ancient Icelandic settlers developed methods for creating stable pathways across lava fields. Even modern geothermal plants use similar principles for heat management. But will it work on the scale I need? Jiho asked. 50 kilometers is a lot different from a few meters. That's the beautiful part, Mina replied, pulling up a complex diagram on her screen. The process is scalable. Each section you cool makes the next section easier to handle. It's like creating a chain reaction of stability instead of destruction. She showed him calculations that demonstrated how the cooling process would create what she called a thermal cascade. The initial application of cooling materials would lower the surface temperature enough to allow more material to be applied, which would lower the temperature further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The key is starting with the right mixture. An application method, Mina explained. Too little cooling material and it won't have any effect. Too much and you risk thermal shock that could create dangerous fractures. But get it right, and you'll create a pathway that's actually stronger than the original rock. As they talked, Jiho shared some of the data he had found in the Galactic archives about other worlds that had used similar techniques. Mina became increasingly excited as she cross-referenced the information with her own research. Jiho, this isn't just about solving your assignment, she said finally. If this works, it could revolutionize how the galaxy approaches volcanic planets. There are hundreds of worlds that are currently considered uninhabitable because of volcanic activity. Your method could open them up for colonization. Meanwhile, in the advanced laboratories of the Academy, Jiho's classmates were making impressive progress on their technological solutions. The Luxoid team had successfully demonstrated a small-scale light bridge that could support several tons of weight. The Nethan atmospheric manipulation system was showing promising results in computer simulations. Sektal's gravity negation platform had passed its initial testing phase with flying colors. But each of these solutions came with enormous costs and complex requirements. The light bridge needed constant power input from fusion reactors. The atmospheric system required precise monitoring and adjustment across a vast area. The gravity platform depended on rare materials that would cost millions of credits to obtain. When Professor Veltar made his weekly rounds to check on student progress, he found Jiho in one of the basic chemistry labs, working with simple equipment that looked primitive compared to the molecular manipulators and quantum computers being used by other teams. Still working with mud, I see, Veltar observed, his crystalline features reflecting the lab's lights in complex patterns. Refined mud, Jiho corrected with a smile. I've been able to optimize the mixture ratio based on local mineral content. The cooling efficiency is actually better than I initially calculated. Veltar picked up one of Jiho's sample containers, examining the dark mixture inside. And you believe this simple combination of earth and water can accomplish what our most advanced technologies cannot? I believe that working with natural forces is often more effective than fighting against them, Jiho replied. The lava field isn't an enemy to be defeated. It's a natural system that can be influenced if you understand how it works. The professor set down the sample container and studied Jiho with an expression that was difficult to read. Your species has an interesting perspective on engineering challenges. Most civilizations focus on developing more powerful technologies to overcome obstacles. Humans seem to prefer finding ways around them. Maybe that's because we're still young as a spacefaring species, Jiho suggested. We haven't had time to develop technologies that can overpower natural forces, so we've learned to work with them instead. Perhaps, Veltar mused, or perhaps there is wisdom in approaches that more advanced civilizations have forgotten. After the professor left, Jiho continued working on his mixture formulations. He had moved beyond simple testing now and was preparing larger quantities of his cooling compound. The basic chemistry lab wasn't equipped for the kind of advanced analysis his classmates could perform, but it was sufficient for what he needed. As he worked, other students occasionally wandered by to observe his progress. Most came out of curiosity, wanting to see what the primitive human was up to. Some offered advice about more sophisticated approaches he could take. A few simply laughed and moved on, but a small number seemed genuinely interested in his methodology. A young Repthari from a lower-year class spent an entire afternoon watching Jiho work, asking detailed questions about thermal dynamics and heat transfer principles. Two Nethan students requested copies of his calculations, claiming they wanted to understand alternative approaches to engineering problems. Most surprisingly, Dr. Kethvar, the Academy's most distinguished engineering professor, stopped by late one evening when the lab was otherwise empty. "I've been reviewing your preliminary data," the elderly professor said without preamble. "Your thermal transfer calculations are quite sophisticated, despite your simple materials." "Thank you, sir," Jiho replied, not sure whether he was being complimented or criticized. "I'm curious about something," Dr. Kethavar continued. "Your approach assumes that the lava field can be treated as a cooperative system rather than a hostile environment. This is contrary to how we typically approach engineering challenges. What led you to this perspective?" Jiho thought for a moment before answering. "On Earth, we have a saying, you can't fight Mother Nature and win. Volcanic activity is one of the most powerful forces on any planet. Trying to overpower it seems like a losing strategy. But if you understand how it works, you can sometimes convince it to work with you instead of against you." Dr. Kethvar nodded slowly. "Convince it to work with you. An interesting choice of words." He paused, examining some of Jiho's samples. "You know, when I was a young student, before I learned about force fields and energy manipulation, my people used similar methods to deal with the natural hazards on our world. We called it asking the planet's permission instead of simply taking what we wanted. Demonstration Day arrived with all the ceremony befitting the Galactic Engineering Academy's most challenging assignment. Representatives from major engineering firms throughout the galaxy had traveled to Pyros 7 to observe the student presentations. The Academy's main amphitheater buzzed with excitement as beings from dozens of different worlds gathered to witness what many expected would be spectacular failures. Professor Veltar stood at the center of the amphitheater, his crystalline form catching the morning light and casting rainbow patterns across the assembled crowd. Behind him, holographic displays showed real-time readings from the lava field, where surface temperatures had climbed even higher than usual due to increased solar activity. Today, our students will demonstrate their solutions to one of the galaxy's most persistent engineering challenges, Veltar announced. The great lava field of Pyros 7 has defeated every attempt at crossing for over 5 centuries. We shall see whether this new generation of engineers can succeed where their predecessors have failed. The first team to present was the Luxoids, whose energy-based forms crackled with nervous excitement as they took their positions at the demonstration control station. Their solution was visually spectacular, a bridge of pure light that stretched across a section of the lava field like a rainbow made solid. Our photon bridge utilizes concentrated light streams to create a stable pathway, the team leader explained, her voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that marked her species' communication. The bridge automatically adjusts its density and refraction to maintain stability under changing conditions. The demonstration began impressively. The light bridge formed exactly as designed, creating a glowing pathway that seemed to float just above the molten rock. Test drones successfully crossed the bridge, transmitting clear signals that confirmed the pathway's stability and load-bearing capacity. For 15 minutes, everything worked perfectly. The assembled observers murmured appreciatively as the elegant solution demonstrated its capabilities. Then, Pyros 7's solar interference patterns began to shift. The planet's unique magnetic field created unpredictable interactions with electromagnetic radiation, and as the local star's emissions changed frequency, the light bridge began to fluctuate. The carefully calculated photon streams started to destabilize, causing sections of the bridge to flicker and waver. Compensating for solar interference, the Luxoid team leader announced, her harmonics taking on a strained quality as she worked to maintain control. But the interference patterns were too complex and changed too rapidly for even the Luxoids' advanced control systems to track. Within minutes, the entire bridge collapsed into scattered light that dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere. The test drones that had been crossing at the time plummeted into the lava field and were instantly destroyed. An excellent attempt, Professor Veltar commented diplomatically. Solar interference has always been a challenge for light-based technologies on Pyros 7. The Nethan team's atmospheric manipulation system was next. Their approach was more subtle, but equally ambitious, creating a controlled environment above the lava field that would allow conventional transportation to operate safely. The initial setup was flawless. The Nethans, working in perfect coordination from their environmental suits, established a stable atmospheric pocket that extended across several kilometers of the lava field. Temperature sensors confirmed that the controlled environment maintained comfortable conditions despite the inferno below. Our system creates a localized atmosphere with optimal pressure, temperature, and composition, the team spokesperson explained through their translation device. Standard vehicles can operate within this environment without specialized protection. The demonstration proceeded smoothly until the system encountered the lava field's natural convection patterns. The rising heat from the molten surface created powerful air currents that the atmospheric manipulation system hadn't accounted for. These currents began to disrupt the carefully maintained environmental balance. As the Nethans struggled to compensate, the controlled atmosphere started to develop what atmospheric engineers called feedback loops. The system's attempts to maintain Stability actually amplified the natural convection patterns, creating increasingly violent air movements within the controlled space. Warning: dangerous atmospheric instability detected, the Academy's safety systems announced as emergency protocols engaged. The Nethen team was forced to shut down their system before the feedback loops could create a catastrophic atmospheric disturbance. The sudden collapse of the controlled environment sent shockwaves through the surrounding air that rattled the observation platforms and triggered automatic safety barriers. "Well," Professor Veltar said after the emergency systems had finished their safety checks. "Atmospheric engineering is always challenging when dealing with active volcanic systems. Sectal's gravity negation platform was the most sophisticated solution yet attempted. The technology was elegant in its simplicity, using localized gravity fields to lift vehicles entirely above the dangerous surface. The platform appeared to hover effortlessly above the lava field, its sleek design reflecting the molten glow below. Our platform creates a stable gravitational field that operates independently of surface conditions," Sectal explained with obvious pride. "The system is immune to temperature variations, atmospheric disturbances, and electromagnetic interference. The gravity platform performed exactly as advertised, maintaining perfect stability even as surface conditions changed. Test loads were transported across successfully, and all systems showed optimal performance. For almost an hour, it seemed like Sectal's team had finally achieved success. Then the lava field's unique magnetic properties began to interfere with the platform's guidance systems. Pyrrho 7's volcanic core generated powerful and chaotic magnetic fields that changed unpredictably as molten rock moved beneath the surface. These fields had no effect on the gravity negation system itself, but they wreaked havoc on the electronic systems that controlled the platform's movement. The BES platform began to drift off course, its guidance computers unable to maintain accurate positioning in the chaotic magnetic environment. Automated safety systems tried to compensate, but the magnetic interference was too severe and unpredictable for any electronic system to handle reliably. "Platform guidance compromised," Sectal announced, his usual confidence replaced by obvious concern. "Magnetic interference exceeding compensation parameters." The gravity platform, now completely uncontrolled, drifted steadily toward the most active section of the lava field. Despite desperate attempts by the Repthari team to regain control, the platform finally crashed into a fountain of molten rock and was consumed by the inferno. "Magnetic fields," Professor Veltar sighed. "Always problematic for electronic guidance systems in volcanic environments." As the third sophisticated solution failed catastrophically, the mood in the amphitheater grew somber. The observers who had come expecting to witness engineering breakthroughs were instead watching demonstration after demonstration of expensive failures. Murmured conversations in the gallery suggested that perhaps the lava field truly was impossible to cross. "Well," Professor Veltar announced, "we have one final presentation. Human student Jiho Kim will demonstrate his alternative approach." The change in tone was immediately obvious. Where the previous presentations had been introduced with descriptions of advanced technologies and sophisticated engineering principles, Jiho's approach was labeled simply as alternative. The implications were clear to everyone present. Jiho walked to the demonstration area carrying only a simple cart filled with what appeared to be ordinary mud. The contrast with the elaborate control systems used by previous teams was stark. He wore no environmental suit, carried no advanced instruments, and showed no signs of the nervous excitement that had marked his classmates' presentations. "My approach is different from what you've seen," Jiho began, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustics. "Instead of using technology to fight against the lava field's natural properties, I want to work with them." He gestured toward his cart of materials. "These mixtures use local clay and volcanic ash to rapidly cool molten rock through controlled heat absorption. The process creates a stable, permanent pathway that actually becomes stronger over time." Dr. Kethvar leaned forward in his seat among the distinguished observers. "And how much did these materials cost to prepare?" 47 credits, Jiho replied, "including transportation costs for collection and basic laboratory processing." The silence that followed was profound. The previous solutions had required millions of credits worth of equipment and exotic materials. The Luxoid light bridge alone had consumed more energy than many planets used in a month. And here was a human claiming he could solve the same problem for less than the cost of a decent meal. 47 credits, Professor Veltar repeated slowly. "To cross a 50-kilometer lava field that has defeated the galaxy's greatest engineering minds for centuries." "Yes, sir," Jiho confirmed, "though that's just for materials. Labor costs would depend on how quickly you wanted the crossing completed." Scattered laughter rippled through the gallery, though it carried an edge of nervous uncertainty. The previous failures had shaken. The amphitheater fell completely silent as Jiho continued his methodical work at the lava field's edge. Steam rose steadily from the cooling surface, creating small clouds that drifted away in the morning breeze. What had started as a small test platform was rapidly growing into something much larger and more impressive. Dr. Kethvar had abandoned his seat among the distinguished observers and was now standing at the platform's edge, scanner in hand, taking readings that seemed to defy everything he understood about thermal dynamics. His elderly face showed a mixture of scientific excitement and professional bewilderment. "Professor Veltar," Dr. Kethvar called out, his voice carrying unusual urgency. "You need to see these readings. The thermal absorption rate is unprecedented, but there's no explosive fracturing, no structural instability. The surface is actually becoming more stable as it cools." Professor Veltar moved to join his colleague, his crystalline features reflecting the scanner's display lights as he studied the data. "This is impossible according to standard thermal stress models. The cooling rate should create massive internal tensions." "That's what I thought too," Dr. Kethvar replied, adjusting his scanner for more detailed analysis. "But look at the molecular structure of the cooled material. It's not just solidified lava anymore. The human's mixture has fundamentally changed the rock's composition during the cooling process." Meanwhile, Jiho continued his work, seemingly oblivious to the scientific revolution he was creating among the observers. His movements were steady and practiced, showing none of the nervous energy that had marked the previous presentations. Every few minutes, he would pause to check the stability of his pathway before adding the next section. In the gallery, representatives from major engineering firms were frantically taking notes and making urgent communications to their home offices. What they were witnessing could potentially revolutionize the entire field of planetary engineering. If a simple mud mixture could accomplish what trillion-credit technologies could not, the implications were staggering. "How is this possible?" whispered Zethmar, chief engineer for the Galactic Colonial Development Corporation. "Our teams have spent decades developing technologies to deal with volcanic environments. How did we miss something this basic?" His companion, a senior researcher from the Advanced Materials Institute, shook her head in amazement. "We've been so focused on overpowering hostile environments that we never considered working with them instead. This human is using the lava, field's own energy, against itself." By midday, Jiho had created a solid pathway extending nearly 5 kilometers across the lava field. The pathway was not only stable, but appeared to be self-reinforcing. Each new section cooled more quickly than the last, as the surrounding cooled material provided a thermal foundation that enhanced the cooling process. Professor Veltar finally approached Jiho directly, accompanied by Dr. Kethvar and several other senior faculty members. The human looked up from his work, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling effects of his own creation. "Human," Professor Veltar said formally, "please explain the theoretical foundation for your approach. Our instruments indicate that you have achieved something that should be impossible, according to established thermodynamics." Jiho set down his spreading tool and wiped his hands on a simple cloth. "It's not really that complicated," he said. "The mixture absorbs heat very rapidly, but it also changes the chemical structure of the lava as it cools. Instead of just solidifying the molten rock, it's creating a new composite material that's stronger and more stable than either component alone." "But the thermal shock," Dr. Kethvar protested. "Rapid cooling should create massive structural failures." "It would, if I was just cooling the lava," Jiho agreed. "But I'm not just cooling it. The clay and ash mixture creates controlled nucleation points for crystallization. Instead of random cooling that creates stress fractures, the mixture guides the cooling process to create a stable crystal matrix." He gestured toward the pathway he had created. "Each section provides thermal mass for the next section, making the cooling process more controlled and less violent. It's like teaching the lava how to cool properly instead of just forcing it to cool quickly." The professors exchanged glances that conveyed professional amazement mixed with academic embarrassment. The human was describing principles that were well established in material science, but applied in a way that none of them had considered. "And you learned these techniques where?" Professor Veltar asked. "My sister taught me the basic principles," Jiho replied. "She's a geologist on Earth, but mostly I learned by watching how natural cooling processes work on volcanic worlds. The techniques aren't new, they're just forgotten." As the afternoon wore on, Jiho's pathway continued to grow. Word of the unprecedented demonstration had spread throughout the academy, and students and faculty from every department had gathered to witness what many were already calling the most significant engineering breakthrough in centuries. The pathway now extended over 20 kilometers, more than halfway across the entire lava field. Automated testing drones confirmed that the surface could support massive loads without any sign of structural weakness. More importantly, the pathway showed no signs of degradation despite the extreme environment surrounding it. "This is remarkable," commented Dr. Evil Thesis, the Academy's leading expert on extreme environment engineering. "The human has created a permanent infrastructure solution using materials that cost less than our daily laboratory budget." But the most amazing discovery came when Dr. Kethvar's detailed scans revealed that the pathway was actually improving over time. The continued heat from the surrounding lava was causing additional chemical reactions within the cooled material, making it progressively stronger and more resilient. "It's a self-improving system," Dr. Kethvar announced to the assembled observers. "The pathway will continue to strengthen for months, possibly years after construction. Eventually, it could become one of the most durable surfaces on the planet." As evening approached, Jiho reached the final section of the lava field. The last few kilometers proved to be the easiest, as the thermal mass of the completed pathway made the cooling process incredibly efficient. With the sun setting behind him, casting long shadows across his revolutionary creation, Jiho applied the final applications of his mud mixture to complete the crossing. When he finally stood up and walked back along the completed pathway, the silence in the amphitheater was absolute. 50 kilometers of deadly lava field had been transformed into a stable roadway, using nothing more sophisticated than specially prepared mud and the determination of a single human student. Professor Veltar was the first to break the silence. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all classifications," he announced formally, "we have just witnessed the successful completion of an impossible engineering challenge. Human student Jiho Kim has achieved what 5 centuries of advanced technology could not accomplish." The applause that followed was unlike anything Jiho had ever experienced. It started slowly, as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in, then built to a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Academy. Beings from dozens of different worlds were united in their amazement at what human ingenuity had accomplished. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from his classmates. Sektal was the first to approach, his usual arrogance replaced by obvious respect and admiration. "Human Jiho," the Repthari said formally, "I owe you a profound apology. I called your methods primitive, but what you have accomplished today is the most sophisticated engineering I have ever witnessed." Similar sentiments came from students throughout the amphitheater. The Luxoids expressed amazement at the elegant efficiency of his solution. The Nethans requested detailed explanations of his thermal management techniques. Even the most advanced students from species with technologies beyond human understanding wanted to learn from the simple methods that had succeeded where their complexity had failed. As the formal demonstration concluded and observers began to disperse, Jiho found himself surrounded by professors, industry representatives, and fellow students, all eager to understand how such a simple approach had achieved such extraordinary results. But in the back of his mind, Jiho was already thinking about his next communication with his sister, Mina. She had been right about the potential implications of his work. The successful crossing of the great lava field of Pyros 7 was just the beginning. There were hundreds of worlds throughout the galaxy where similar techniques could be applied, opening up vast new possibilities for colonization and development. The human had not just crossed a lava field, he had bridged the gap between advanced technology and practical wisdom, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions came not from building something new, but from remembering something old. As night fell over Pyros 7, the completed pathway glowed softly in the darkness, cooled lava reflecting starlight like a river of black glass stretching from horizon to horizon. It was beautiful, functional, and permanent, a testament to the power of working with nature instead of against it. Tomorrow, Jiho knew, everything would change. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as he looked out over his impossible accomplishment. The news of Jiho's breakthrough spread across the galaxy faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours of the demonstration's conclusion, subspace communication networks were buzzing with reports of the impossible achievement on Pyros 7. By the next morning, the Galactic Engineering Academy found itself at the center of the largest scientific controversy in recent memory. Emergency faculty meetings had been called throughout the night, with professors debating the implications of what they had witnessed. The Academy's communication systems were overwhelmed with requests for information from universities, engineering firms, and government agencies across dozens of worlds. Everyone wanted to understand how a first-year human student had solved a problem that had defeated the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries. Professor Veltar stood before the assembled Galactic Engineering Council, his crystalline features reflecting the harsh lights of the emergency session chamber. The council had convened in record time, with representatives from major civilizations attending either in person or through holographic projection. "Honored members of the council," Veltar began, his voice carrying the weight of professional uncertainty. Yesterday's demonstration has forced us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about advanced engineering methodologies. Council Chairman Mordeth, an ancient being whose species had mastered space travel before humans had discovered fire, leaned forward in his floating chair. "Professor Veltar, are you telling this council that a primitive human has succeeded where our most sophisticated technologies have failed?" "With respect, Chairman, I no longer consider human engineering methods to be primitive," Veltar replied carefully. "What we witnessed yesterday was sophisticated in ways we failed to recognize." The council chamber erupted in multilingual protests and demands for clarification. Representatives from species that prided themselves on technological supremacy found it difficult to accept that their approaches might be fundamentally flawed. Meanwhile, in his dormitory room, Jiho was experiencing his own version of chaos. His communication device had been receiving calls constantly since dawn, with requests for interviews, job offers, and invitations to speak at conferences throughout the galaxy. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had simply been trying to complete a class assignment. Yuna knocked on his door around mid-morning, carrying a cup of human coffee that had become precious currency among the Academy's small human population. "You look like you need this," she said, handing him the steaming cup. "The entire Academy is talking about nothing but your demonstration. Half the professors are excited, and the other half are having existential crises about their life's work." Jiho gratefully accepted the coffee and gestured for Yuna to sit down. "I never expected this kind of reaction. It was just a class project." A class project that invalidated centuries of scientific assumptions, Yuna pointed out with a grin. "Do you realize what you've done? Every volcanic world in the galaxy is suddenly accessible for development. Colonial expansion plans that were abandoned decades ago are being dusted off and reconsidered." Before Jiho could respond, his communication device chimed with an incoming priority call. The caller identification showed the seal of the Galactic Colonial Development Corporation, one of the largest engineering firms in known space. Director. Kolveth appeared on the screen, his reptilian features showing barely controlled excitement. "Human Jiho Kim, I am contacting you with an urgent business proposition. Our corporation is prepared to offer you a position as Chief Innovation Consultant, with compensation that exceeds the annual budget of most planetary governments." "Thank you for the offer," Jiho replied carefully. "But I'm still a student. I haven't even finished my first year at the Academy." "Irrelevant," Director Kolveth declared. "Your demonstration yesterday has made formal education obsolete. We need your expertise immediately for 17 different colonial projects that were deemed impossible before your breakthrough." Similar calls followed throughout the day, each offering increasingly extravagant compensation for Jiho's knowledge and methods. The Universal Construction Consortium offered to fund an entire research institute in his name. The Galactic Terraforming Alliance wanted to license his techniques for use on every volcanic world in their territory. The most unexpected call came from Dr. Sevteran, the legendary engineer whose failed attempt to cross the Pyros 7 lava field had become a cautionary tale told to engineering students throughout the galaxy. "Young human," the elderly scientist said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated wisdom and humility. "I have spent 40 years trying to overcome that lava field, using every advanced technology available to our civilization. Yesterday, you succeeded using methods that I dismissed as primitive without ever truly understanding them." Dr. Sevtaran paused, and when he continued, his tone carried genuine admiration. "I am calling to request permission to study your techniques, not to commercialize them, but to understand where my own thinking went wrong. You have taught an old engineer that advancement sometimes means returning to principles we thought we had outgrown." That evening, a special assembly was called at the Academy. The main amphitheater was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds, watching through holographic projections in adjacent halls. Representatives from major civilizations, distinguished professors, and students from every department had gathered to hear what many were calling the most significant lecture in the Academy's history. Professor Veltar took the stage first, his crystalline form somehow seeming more subdued than usual. "Today we must acknowledge that our understanding of advanced engineering has been fundamentally incomplete. We have been so focused on developing more complex technologies that we forgot to examine whether complexity was always the optimal solution. He gestured toward the massive holographic display that showed detailed analysis of Jiho's pathway across the lava field. What human student Jiho Kim accomplished yesterday was not primitive engineering. It was sophisticated engineering that we failed to recognize as such because it did not rely on technologies we associate with advancement. When Jiho finally took the stage, the silence in the amphitheater was absolute. He looked out at the sea of alien faces, representatives of civilizations that had been exploring space when Earth was still cooling from its own formation, and felt the weight of their expectations. I want to start by saying that I didn't invent anything new, Jiho began. The techniques I used have been known for thousands of years on dozens of worlds. They're recorded in your own historical archives, if you know where to look. He activated the holographic display to show examples from across the galaxy. The ancient Veltari used controlled cooling to build cities on volcanic worlds. The early Nathanic colonies employed atmospheric modification techniques that worked with natural processes instead of against them. The Luxoid homeworld, still, has structures built using light manipulation methods that required no external power sources. Dr. Kethvar stood up from the audience. If these techniques were known, why were they abandoned? Because they were replaced by more advanced technologies, Jiho replied. And then those technologies were replaced by even more advanced ones. Each generation of engineers learned more sophisticated methods and forgot the simple ones that actually worked. The implications hit the audience like a physical force. Civilizations throughout the galaxy had been making the same mistake, assuming that newer technologies were automatically better than older ones. They had been building increasingly complex solutions to problems that could be solved more effectively, with approaches their ancestors had already developed. Sektal raised one of his forearms. Are you suggesting that technological advancement has been counterproductive? Not counterproductive, Jiho clarified, but incomplete. Advancement should mean finding better solutions, not necessarily more complex ones. Sometimes the best solution is also the simplest one. The questions continued for hours, with representatives from every major civilization trying to understand how their fundamental assumptions about engineering and technology had been so thoroughly wrong. But perhaps the most important question came from a young student in the back of the amphitheater. How do we change the way we think about engineering problems? The student asked. Jiho thought for a moment before answering. Start by asking different questions. Instead of, how can we overpower this obstacle? Try asking, how can we work with the forces that created this obstacle? Instead of, what's the most advanced solution? Ask, what's the most effective solution? He looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing representatives of dozens of species that had spent millennia developing technologies beyond human comprehension. Every civilization in this room has knowledge that could revolutionize how we approach engineering challenges. The problem isn't that we don't know enough. The problem is that we've forgotten how to remember what we already know. As the assembly concluded and beings from across the galaxy began to disperse, many carrying with them fundamentally changed perspectives on technology and engineering. Jiho reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a struggling student working on what seemed like an impossible assignment. Now he had inadvertently sparked a galaxy-wide reconsider. 2 years had passed since Jiho first stepped onto the observation deck at the Galactic Engineering Academy and looked out at what everyone said was an impossible challenge. Now, he stood in the same spot, but everything had changed. The Academy had been transformed from a place where students learned to build increasingly complex technologies into a center for what was being called integrated engineering, the combination of ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the volcanic landscape of Pyros 7, but the view was dramatically different. Where once there had been an impassable barrier of molten rock, now there was a thriving transportation corridor. The pathway Jiho had built had become the foundation for a permanent road that carried trade and travel between the planet's two continents. More importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when engineers worked with natural forces instead of against them. Today was special for more than symbolic reasons. The Academy was hosting its first annual conference on practical engineering solutions, and attendees had come from every corner of the galaxy. The conference was a celebration of the revolution in thinking that had started with one human student's refusal to accept that complex problems required complex solutions. Professor Veltar, now the Academy's Director of Integrated Engineering Studies, stood at the podium in the main amphitheater. His crystalline features caught the morning light as he addressed an audience that included some of the galaxy's most distinguished minds. 2 years ago, Veltar began, a human student challenged our fundamental assumptions about engineering excellence. Today we gather to celebrate not just his individual achievement, but the collective rediscovery of principles that have transformed how our civilizations approach problem-solving. The numbers were remarkable. The Kim method had been successfully applied to challenges on over 200 worlds. Colonial expansion had increased by 400% as previously uninhabitable planets became accessible. The galactic economy was experiencing unprecedented growth as resources that had been unreachable were suddenly available for development. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real transformation was philosophical. Engineering schools throughout the galaxy had fundamentally changed how they taught problem-solving. Instead of starting with available technologies and trying to apply them to challenges, students now learn to start with the challenge itself and look for the most effective solution, regardless of its technological complexity. Dr. Sevtaran took the stage next, his elderly frame somehow seeming more energetic than it had 2 years earlier. The legendary engineer had become the galaxy's foremost advocate for what he called engineering humility, the recognition that wisdom could come from any source, regardless of its technological sophistication. I spent 40 years trying to prove how advanced my knowledge was, Dr. Sevtaran said to the assembled crowd. It took a young human to teach me that true advancement means being smart enough to recognize when simple solutions are better than complex ones. He gestured toward a holographic display showing dozens of successful projects that had used variations of practical engineering approaches. These achievements represent more than technical success. They represent a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between intelligence and complexity. The display showed Luxoid colonies using ancient light manipulation techniques that required no external power sources. Nethan settlements employed atmospheric modification, methods that worked with planetary weather patterns instead of trying to control them. Repthari mining operations used geological processes to extract resources more efficiently than any mechanical system. Perhaps most remarkably, every one of these projects had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. The practical engineering approach wasn't just more effective, it was more efficient. When Jiho finally took the stage, the applause was thunderous and sustained, but he noticed something that pleased him more than the recognition. In the audience, he could see students from dozens of different species taking notes, not with advanced holographic systems, but with simple notebooks and writing instruments. The tools for thinking, he had learned, were often more important than the tools for building. When I first proposed cooling lava with mud, Jiho began, most people thought I was either brave or foolish. Looking back, I think I was just curious about whether there might be a better way to approach the problem. He activated a holographic display that showed the current state of engineering education throughout the galaxy. Universities that had once focused exclusively on cutting-edge technologies now required courses in historical engineering methods. Students learned to study failed solutions as intensively as successful ones, understanding that knowing why something didn't work was often more valuable than knowing why something did work. The most important lesson we've learned, Jiho continued, is that every civilization in this galaxy has pieces of the puzzle. The Veltari understood thermodynamics in ways we're still discovering. The ancient Nethans developed atmospheric techniques that surpass anything we can build today. The early Luxoid colonies created sustainable energy systems that modern technology can't improve upon. The audience listened intently as Jiho explained how the Kim Institute had become a center for what they called archaeological engineering, the systematic study of historical solutions to contemporary problems. Teams of researchers were working on every inhabited world, documenting traditional techniques and testing their applications to modern challenges. We've discovered that technological advancement isn't always linear, Jiho explained. Sometimes civilizations develop incredibly effective solutions early in their history, then abandon them when newer technologies become available. But newer doesn't always mean better. Yuna joined him on stage, representing the thousands of maintenance engineers, construction workers, and practical technicians who had become key contributors to the new engineering philosophy. Her research on real-world engineering had revolutionized how complex systems were designed and maintained. Academic engineering and practical engineering used to be separate fields, Yuna said. Theorists designed systems that looked perfect on paper, and then practical workers had to figure out how to make them actually function in the real world. Now we're designing systems that work from the beginning because we're including practical perspectives from the start. She gestured toward a display showing maintenance records from across the galaxy. Equipment failure rates have dropped by 60% since we started designing for real conditions instead of ideal ones. Maintenance costs have been cut by almost half, and worker satisfaction has increased dramatically because people are working with tools that actually function as intended. The conference continued for 3 days, with presentations on successful applications of practical engineering principles from across the galaxy. Each presentation reinforced the same fundamental message. Effective engineering meant understanding both the problem and the environment in which the solution would operate. On the final day, a special ceremony was held to honor the Academy's first graduating class of integrated engineering students. These students had learned both advanced technologies and historical techniques, preparing them to approach challenges with the full range of available solutions, rather than limiting themselves to the newest or most sophisticated options. Tejo was among the graduates, having specialized in volcanic planet development, using techniques derived from human geological knowledge, combined with advanced alien materials science. His thesis project had successfully opened 3 new worlds for colonization, using methods that cost 90% less than traditional approaches. Sori had focused on atmospheric engineering, developing hybrid systems that combined methane gas, manipulation techniques with ancient weatherworking methods from her own world. Her innovations were being used to terraform marginal planets that had previously been considered uninhabitable. Junho had become an expert in structural engineering, creating buildings that used traditional load distribution techniques enhanced, with modern materials to create structures that were both stronger and less expensive than conventional designs. As the ceremony concluded, Professor Veltar made an announcement that surprised everyone, including Jiho. The Galactic Engineering Council has approved the establishment of permanent practical engineering centers on 50 worlds throughout the galaxy. These centers will serve as repositories for traditional knowledge and testing grounds for integrated solutions. He paused, his crystalline features reflecting the ceremony's lights in complex patterns. Master Engineer Jiho Kim has been invited to serve as the director of the entire network, with authority to establish curriculum and research, priorities for practical engineering education throughout known space. The offer was overwhelming in its scope and implications. Jiho would essentially be responsible for institutionalizing the philosophical change that had begun with his simple demonstration on Pyros 7. The position would give him the authority to ensure that future generations of engineers learn to value effective solutions over complex ones. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Sektal approached him after the ceremony. 6 months after the historic demonstration on Pyros 7, the galaxy was experiencing what historians would later call the Great Engineering Renaissance. Universities throughout known space had begun revising their curricula to include courses on practical engineering principles and natural systems integration. The Kim method, as it had become officially known, was being adapted and applied to challenges on dozens of worlds. Jiho found himself in the unexpected position of being the galaxy's most sought-after engineering consultant, despite still being technically a first-year student. The Galactic Engineering Council had awarded him the title of Master Engineer First Class, the youngest being ever to receive such recognition, and the first human to be honored at any level. The ceremony took place in the Great Hall of the Galactic Engineering Council on Nexus Prime, the capital world of the Galactic Confederation. Representatives from every major civilization attended, along with the most distinguished engineers from across known space. The hall itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built using techniques from hundreds of different worlds and designed to accommodate beings with vastly different environmental needs. Council Chairman Mordeth presided over the ceremony, his ancient voice carrying across the vast chamber through translation systems that had been updated to better handle the nuanced concepts that Jiho's work had introduced to galactic engineering vocabulary. For the first time in the 700-year history of this council, Chairman Mordeth announced, "We recognize an engineer not for developing new technologies, but for helping us remember wisdom we had forgotten. Master Engineer Jiho Kim has demonstrated that true advancement sometimes means returning to principles our ancestors understood better than we do." The title came with more than just recognition. Jiho was granted access to the Galactic Engineering Archives, a vast repository of technical knowledge that contained the accumulated wisdom of every spacefaring civilization. More importantly, he was authorized to establish his own research institute with unlimited funding and the authority to recruit talent from across the galaxy. But the greatest honor came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sevtaran, the legendary engineer whose failed attempts to cross the Piro 7 lava field had become famous throughout the galaxy, requested permission to become Jiho's first research associate. "I have spent 60 years learning to build more complex solutions," the elderly scientist said during his formal application. "I would like to spend whatever time remains learning to build better ones." The Kim Institute for Practical Engineering was established on Piro 7 itself, in a facility built using an integration of techniques from dozens of different civilizations. The Institute's first project was a comprehensive review of forgotten technologies, simple but effective solutions that had been abandoned in favor of more sophisticated approaches. The results were staggering. Research teams discovered that the galaxy's civilizations collectively possessed solutions to virtually every major engineering challenge, but the knowledge was scattered across different worlds and different eras. Ancient cooling techniques from one world could solve modern atmospheric problems on another. Structural methods developed by primitive civilizations could enhance the stability of advanced space stations. Yuna had accepted Jiho's invitation to serve as the Institute's Director of Applied Research, bringing her practical maintenance experience to bear on theoretical engineering problems. Her first major contribution was the development of what became known as the maintenance engineer's perspective. The idea that understanding how systems fail in practice was more valuable than understanding how they work in theory. Engineers design for ideal conditions, Yuna explained to a gathering of distinguished academics. Maintenance workers deal with real conditions. If you want to build something that actually works, start by understanding what actually breaks. This philosophy led to revolutionary improvements in everything from spacecraft design to planetary infrastructure. Instead of building systems that were theoretically perfect but practically fragile, engineers began designing for reliability, simplicity, and ease of repair. Meanwhile, other human students had begun arriving at the Galactic Engineering Academy in unprecedented numbers. What had been a small exchange program became a major diplomatic initiative as alien civilizations recognized the value of human engineering perspectives. Taiho, Sori, and Junho were among the first to benefit from the new opportunities, finding themselves welcomed into advanced programs that had previously been closed to their species. The most significant validation of Jiho's approach came when the Galactic Colonial Development Corporation announced the successful opening of 17 new worlds using variations of the Kim method. Volcanic planets that had been considered uninhabitable were now thriving colonial settlements. The economic impact was enormous, but the psychological impact was even greater. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's civilizations were looking backward as well as forward for engineering inspiration. Archaeological expeditions were launched to rediscover lost techniques. Historical archives were being studied with the same intensity once reserved for cutting-edge research. The phrase ancient wisdom had acquired new respect in engineering circles. Professor Veltar had become one of the most enthusiastic advocates for the new approach. His crystalline features seemed brighter somehow as he addressed a gathering of the galaxy's most distinguished professors at the Academy's annual symposium. "We have been teaching our students to build more complex solutions," Veltar said, "when we should have been teaching them to build more effective ones. Human engineering philosophy has reminded us that the goal of engineering is not to demonstrate our technological superiority, but to solve actual problems in the real world." The symposium had drawn representatives from universities throughout the galaxy, all eager to learn how to integrate practical engineering principles into their advanced curricula. The irony was not lost on anyone that some of the galaxy's most sophisticated educational institutions were sending delegations to learn from techniques that many had previously dismissed as primitive. Dr. Kethvar, now serving as the Kim Institute's senior theoretical advisor, presented research showing that practical engineering approaches consistently outperformed complex technological solutions in real-world applications. Simplicity, he explained, is not the opposite of sophistication. It is sophistication refined to its essential elements. The most emotional moment of the symposium came when Sektal, now working as a research associate at the Kim Institute, presented his findings on engineering humility. The recognition that effective solutions often came from admitting what you didn't know rather than demonstrating what you did know. "I spent years trying to prove how advanced my engineering knowledge was," Sektal admitted to the assembly. "It took a human to teach me that the most advanced knowledge is often the most basic knowledge applied correctly. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Archaeological Preservation Society, an organization dedicated to protecting the historical heritage of ancient civilizations, awarded Jiho their highest honor for preserving and revitalizing the engineering wisdom of our ancestors. The award ceremony took place in the ruins of the ancient Veltari city of Morthak, where archaeologists had discovered evidence of controlled cooling techniques similar to those Jiho had used on Pyros 7. The city had been built on active volcanic terrain over 3,000 years ago, using methods that had been forgotten when the Veltari developed more advanced technologies. "Your work has done more than solve a contemporary engineering challenge," the Society's president explained. "You have reminded us that our ancestors were not primitive beings waiting for us to become advanced. They were sophisticated engineers who solved complex problems with elegant solutions. Standing among the ancient ruins, looking out at structures that had survived for millennia, using techniques that modern engineers had only recently rediscovered, Jiho felt a profound connection to the long history of intelligent beings working to understand and shape their environment. As the ceremony concluded, and delegations from across the galaxy began to disperse, each carrying new perspectives on engineering and problem-solving back to their homeworlds, Jiho reflected on how much had changed since that morning on Pyros 7, when Professor Veltar had announced what seemed like an impossible assignment. The galaxy's approach to engineering had been fundamentally transformed. Universities were revising their curricula. Colonial expansion was proceeding at unprecedented rates. Ancient wisdom was being rediscovered and integrated with modern knowledge, and at the center of it all was a simple recognition that had somehow been forgotten. The best solution was not necessarily the most complex one. That evening, as Jiho walked through the ancient streets of Morthak, he thought about his sister, Mina, back on Earth. Their next communication was scheduled for the following day, and he was looking forward to sharing the latest developments in what had become a galaxy-wide movement toward practical engineering solutions. The human had not just crossed a lava field or received prestigious awards. He had helped an entire galaxy remember that true advancement meant building on the